Hey, good morning to all my listeners and viewers. Welcome to the next edition of Slaves to the Algo, my podcast on how to stay relevant in the age of AI. And I'm delighted to have with me today as a guest speaker TS Anil, the Group CEO of Monzo Bank. TS is a man who has spent a long life in financial services, but has constantly reinvented himself in those times, starting with being a conventional consumer banker and then moving on to working in payment networks and global roles, and now in a digital bank. Welcome to the show, TS.
Great to be here, Suresh. Thanks for having me. And that's the last time we talk about the fact that I've been a long time anything.
Well, you look young still, so I think that, but you have been, you are, your looks belie, I think, the long experience that you have in financial services, and you've seen the evolution. TS, how would you describe yourself? I mean, would you still call yourself a banker? What's your...
It's interesting, that question about are you a banker or are you a tech startup person is actually a false binary. And, we talk about that a fair amount at Monzo, that, I think it's the false binary because we're both, right? We succeed because we are both. And so I think of myself as really straddling those universes and trying to bring the best of both to the work I do and so on. So my identity, though, is not wrapped up in either one of those things. It's something that sort of sits meta and beyond both those things.
And I like the way that in a program on AI, you're talking about a false binary. So in fact, that's one of the things that I'll talk to you about a little bit, about how these two worlds are literally colliding in many ways. But TS, I think one of the big things that we're trying to do in this program is to demystify the age of the algorithm, as we call it. And one of the things out here is that in many ways, lots of different small and big ways, algorithms are taking over both our personal and our professional lives. And off the bat, if I asked you, as a consumer and as a business professional, to describe two or three kind of really great examples of how this has kind of changed our whole life, things that are running our lives and we don't know about it, what would they be?
Look, at a personal level, the examples abound, right? And we've just learned to take many of those for granted, right? Our social feeds, our shopping recommendations, our travel recommendations, and books I read. So the fact that the choices presented to me with this illusion of free choice all the time always it's in every aspect of it. So I think we see that all the time. My favorite example, though, of an algorithm which I beat is music. So I tend to have to listen to very, very different genres of music. And I have to say that none of the music feeds I have on Apple Music or Spotify or anything have quite therefore cracked that. So I am surprised over there, and it's not a reinforcing music taste sort of recommendations, which is fun for me. So I feel personally gratified that there's at least one algorithm that I appear to be beating.
That's interesting. And, you'll use a couple of interesting thoughts already into that. You talked about the illusion of free choice. And in some ways, isn't that what the perfect algo is trying to do? It's trying to give you the illusion that your choice is free, but in reality, it's taking that choice away from you. And, and then you talked about how you're not actually finding the perfect choice. We keep talking, in our company about how Spotify is almost like, always finds you great experiences. So it's interesting. Why do you think that they're not able to find that? I mean, they obviously have a lot of data about you.
No, I actually enjoy the experience. I think what I'm saying is that I'm gratified that I'm not easy to pigeonhole in terms of taste in music. So I'm gratified that the consequence of that is that I'm not getting only one genre, to use a bad pun, amplified. That I'm not getting only one type of music amplified for me because I listen to a broad range. But there are other aspects of my life where I have a clear preference, and because of which the risk is that it's that preference that gets reinforced every single time I'm in an experience.
And I'm just delving a little bit deeper into that, right? You're saying you're listening to multiple genres in music, and this is true in practically every category. But I think this is a great example, right? Sometimes you want to listen to classical music or jazz, and sometimes it's your old rock music from college days or something. So what is it that's happening out here? Is it that these guys don't have enough data, or that you're your tastes are so eclectic, or that are you choosing to beat the algo as an individual consumer?
No, so that's an example where I'm not trying. I think that it might just be that the tastes cut across very different genres. Like as you said, there's obviously all of the classic rock we grew up on, but there's lots of different flavors of world music that interest me and so on. So it is, I think, the fact that it cuts across very many different kinds of music, that it becomes hard to pigeonhole me as the type that's living in his college classic rock warp, or the person that's only into classical music or only into African music or whatever else, right? So it's happening without effort, and I kind of I like that. So, but who knows? This may be my personal illusion, Suresh.
No, but it's quite fascinating, right? Because I mean, I think all algos are trying to get us all get to into some detail and know you as an individual. And clearly, what you're talking about is an area where the data is available. You are a person of eclectic taste, and it's still not quite able to pin you down. Does that talk to the limitation of the algo maker, the people behind it? Or I had another interesting guest on the show who said, some of the problems that Google can solve, they don't solve because of the business model they follow, where they want to show you the ad. It's not that they can't find the right thing. So do you think there's an example of the business model preventing you from getting the right music, or?
No. So not at all, actually. I think the capability exists to be able to classify me. The business model exists certainly to reinforce that and monetize it. And who knows, Suresh, this may well just be I may well be actually in a pigeonhole category of people that like multiple genres, right? And therefore that's what I meant when I said that maybe it's my personal illusion that I'm not getting pigeonholed, because there is a pigeonhole that says eclectic probably.
Okay, we've got to find this elusive pigeonhole, and I'm sure that's a challenge for you, Spotify and Apple Music. Sure. Find the tastes of the group CEO of Monzo. Give him a better list out here. But moving from your personal thing to your business life, right? I mean, I think in financial services, we've long used data to make decisions. Can you tell us how the use of algorithms, and algorithms is a fancy word for something that, if you remember, I think when we are all starting off our careers, people would come back with a big list, printed list of, you'd give 6 criteria and someone would come back with a printed list of people who meet that criteria. So how has it actually changed over the 20 odd years that you've been in there? You've been in a traditional consumer bank, then you've been in a global payments network. Now you're in a fully digital, tech startup bank. So how has it changed over these years in terms of your business life?
Sure. So look, I think, so I've had, been blessed to have some really interesting professional experiences. And, about 20 years ago, I worked at Capital One in the US, which at the time was really the bleeding edge of bringing analytics not into the business, but building a whole business based on the analytical underpinning, right? You had a whole organization of people that spoke in logarithmic regression models at the time and spreadsheets, right? All the way up to the CEO would present in Excel, so to speak.
I remember Richard Fairbanks had a great talk in one of those things about how the company was built on data.
Yeah, so I got to see a bunch of stuff that was really bleeding edge at the time. I think what's changed in that arc of the 2 or 3 decades there is a few things. One is the automation is a really big deal. So like you, I remember when these dot matrix printers would print out reams and reams of customer names based on something, a few criteria that you threw at it. And that SQL would result in a set of names that would then be manually fed to a telemarketer or whatever else you were doing with it at the time. And obviously automation of all of that stuff is a pretty big deal, right? And just makes things productionized at a very different level. I think the second sort of arc across that is the instantaneity of the whole thing, right? Which is, so the lag between seeing a behavior and prompting an action, either for the company to take or for the individual to take, that gap has shrunk, as well as smartphones and everything else have made the instant aspect of things very different. So the ability to react materially different. And then beyond that, we can talk about this some more in terms of where this is going and the ways in which this starts to get scary. But all of this happening at scale is transformative for the world of business. So what the other thing that I would talk to, in terms of what's changed in that arc is everybody sort of catching up, in the sense that, so like, I give the Capcom example from 20 years ago, but that's par for the course now, right? Back then, right, we used to pride ourselves on the fact that when a customer called into a call center, using caller ID, which was already a thing, even on landlines at the time, using caller ID, you could stream the call into, is it going to be a retention call, or is it going to be a collections call, or is it going to be, what the main likely reason for the customer calling is. So, but stuff like that in the last 20 years, I think the whole world is caught up to those capabilities. So that's the other thing, right? So you're seeing both catch-ups geographically and industries and kinds of companies in the industries, but you're also seeing people leapfrogging, right? People building towards, new capabilities, because they're starting out with that without legacy to migrate.
So that's interesting, right? You talked about the fact that it's automated, it's instantaneous, it's become, industrialized in terms of scale, and you're talking about the fact that it's democratized. But I guess one of the questions that you have is, HBR had this recent thing called the age of relevance, that we're entering the age of relevance. But yet, when you look at it in the financial services industry, we ran this survey for about 100 banks and how relevant they are in terms of, we developed something called relevance quotient. Most people don't think of the bank as being relevant or actually being able to do things for them. What is this a gap? Because it's clearly not technology anymore. And you said it's available to everybody. So why is it that banks are kind of struggling to stay relevant? And clearly the digital banks are trying to come in with a very tech-focused way to try to do this. So what's that thing that's stopping people?
So having already established that I've spent many years in the world of, as you call it, traditional banking, although I have to say none of the banks that I worked in at the time thought they were traditional banks, right? That's the irony of it.
True.
But, so you're going to cost me a lot of friends with whatever I say over here, or I'm going to be buying makeup drinks for lots of friends.
Same friends, Anil.
So here's the thing. I think I said technology is not a barrier because everybody has access to it. But having access to technology and being able to leverage it are different things, right? They say God built the world in 7 days because he had no legacy to start with, and that's true, right? If you're working off of a legacy platform, it's really hard to embed new capability in it without massive amounts of change control expenses and back testing to make sure that everything works. So it's not easy to start with legacy and then try and execute the capabilities that are there. Right? That alone makes a pretty significant difference in how people leverage data. So you're seeing the impact of that when you look at any incumbent industry and the challenger segment within the industry. And I think for us, happy to talk more about the way I think about it, or the way, and stuff that we're doing at Monzo. I think we're able to start with the end, right? And not have to incrementalize our way to an outcome. And that's a pretty big difference, I think, because we don't need, so you can leverage the best of technology as it exists today. And in fact, you can probably call where it's going somewhat and build towards that end state right off the bat. So which is a pretty big difference.
And could you give us a couple of examples of that? I mean, how, you're doing it, it's designed data first, it's completely designed. It's like, it's like you've got created a bank today, right? And that's what Monzo is trying to be.
Lots of examples, right? I'll give you a simple sort of user-facing example. We're not putting an app in front of an analog bank, right? We're a digital bank by design, and people call it digital first, mobile first, things like that. So all of those are phrases which all capture the same thing, that you're building for that world first, and that's what it's optimized for. And almost anything else is an afterthought. Right? And the same thing when you think about a data platform or data infrastructure or anything, you're starting with what the end state ought to look like and what you want to be able to do with it. And that leapfrogging, I think, is pretty profound.
Mm-hmm. And from an algorithmic or a data perspective, are you guys in Monzo kind of saying the kind of data that you capture about customers is different, or how going back to your own pigeonhole Spotify example, are you trying to pigeonhole customers differently in terms of what they might be? Could you I mean, nothing that's confidential, but any examples
Sure.
of how you guys are using data and algos differently?
Look, I mean, nothing that really bears sort of spotlighting in and of itself. So as a data use example, and we're certainly not capturing more or different data on our customers than most other players probably are. I think this gets to where this whole thing starts to become more interesting as we look at the future, where from our perspective, being a mission-oriented bank and and sort of defining ourselves by our mission of trying to make money work for everyone, it's about making tools available to customers to help them manage their money better.
Mm-hmm.
Now, even in saying those words, you get the layer that's in there of trying to build what is good for customers. Now, which is incredibly hard, because what you're trying to do there is to give them the tools that help them save better. But who's to say how much someone should save, right? You're giving them the tools to manage credit better, right? Who's to say what does manage credit better mean to individuals? So you have to create the right tools and embed the data in it to help them make good choices. And the goal is to try and help them manage it in a way that is beneficial for them, and which starts to layer in there for choices about how much should people save. How would you indicate to someone what's the right amount of saving? And those things start to become really interesting questions. And it layers in that who gets to make that decision question, that who gets to steer it, right? There's some fascinating work that you're obviously across, I'm sure, Suresh, right, by behavioral scientists and behavioral economists like Richard Taylor, right, whose book Nudge is amazing, right, because it talks about how you can nudge people into what's better choices, whether it's better health choices. And in his example, one of the early examples he uses in his work is this idea that how you present choices to school kids in the school cafeteria makes them choose healthier options or unhealthy options. It is still free choice. They're still choosing exactly what they're doing. You're not removing stuff off the menu. That is just how it's presented. So it's a fascinating space, and it starts to get really tricky when you layer in who gets to make the decision question.
And fascinating. You talked about behavioral economics. I mean, the entire thing, in Crayon, when we started it, we went back to this whole idea of choice and said, when you have so many choices, how do you actually bring it together? And send me your Spotify playlist, TS. I've got to find a way to get you your pigeonhole in music. That's one of the things that we do. But one of the interesting things that we did is that we looked at this guy called Cialdini, who wrote this book called The Power of Influence. And he talks about how when you provide reasoning, like when you say, well, because I'm recommending something to you, because of that, how consumers tend to respond differently. And so is that the kind of thing that you're trying to do at Monzo? I mean, the whole idea that, as a consumer, if you're given the right information with the right reasoning, you should be able to, you're kind of almost democratizing the way the financial choices are being made. Is that the kind of intent?
That's the intent. And it's, we're just getting started. So plenty to be done, plenty to be grappled with in terms of both building out the right set of capabilities, but also, all of the normative choices that you sort of laid out even in what you said. But yeah, our goal is to make the tools available to customers to help them make choices that are best for them.
And again, it's so fascinating that we started off with Spotify and your music. And I'm coming back to the theme only because if you looked at it in the old days, you just had to buy an album that the record company, legacy company said, this is the way even the greatest hits is compiled. Yeah. And now when you design digital first, you're allowed to basically create your own kind of music for whatever time that you do. And I guess that's what you're trying to do. But I'm kind of switching gears a little bit, right? You worked again, in large banks in a global payment network, and now you're in a digital bank. Are the people around you, when you walk into a meeting, are they different? Are the profiles of those people different? How does a digital first bank look in terms of the people? Are they younger? Are they different? Are they more data savvy?
Yeah, so yes to all of those last few questions for sure, right? Because as I said, we straddle the world of tech startups and digital banking. So for sure that there's a whole different generation of people that have grown up into the digital world and who think digital first, not as a thing to do, but just because that's the way they're wired. So you encounter wickedly bright people of every generation, right? I've always felt that way, in the jobs I've done. Has been the funnest has been to work with the best people of a generation. And I think the difference is, for at least for me, the most energizing part of any place I've ever worked in, and Monzo is certainly a great example of that, is working with learners and not the learned, right? Because given the pace at which change is happening, it's most fun when you're not working just with people that are already expert in something, but are learners in a way that they're shaping the future because they're trying to figure it out as we go. And I think that's where the eventual edge kicks in.
That's such a wonderful phrase, and I'm just going to borrow it wholesale. I mean, no,
it's not
working with learners and not the learned, but it's such a wonderful way to describe it, because I guess the question is, when you walk into the room there and you're actually dealing with these people, are they, somebody like you who's, probably both a learner and a learned, are they kind of not overawed? They don't seem to be overawed by the fact that you have 20 years of experience, how payments has evolved. They think very differently. And for the benefit of people listening, what's that kind of thing look like to you? What do you feel like when you're with a 25-year-old guy who says, who talks very differently, who says, here's what the data shows? I get that all the time. So I'm wondering whether you do.
Yeah. So, I mean, I love it, right? I love the challenge of that. I love the fact that in a particular debate, it's less about, everything that led up to that moment in a room, and it's about what you're looking at in that room. So and Capital One was like that as well, all the way back 20 years ago, where, the truth-seeking aspect of it, right, was the most energizing, right? The fact that the answer was in the data, right? We could have points of view, but if you interrogated the data sufficiently, the truth lay within the data, right? And I think that was energizing. In the digital banking Monzo context, as you're asking me now, it's that same sort of idea that you debate the merits of something, and there isn't a discounting of experience or previous knowledge. It's an input, right? So how do you leverage that best to create the right answer? But if you don't interrogate it, you'll never reinvent an industry, right? If you don't interrogate tribal beliefs or the way things have been done, you don't create the future. So balancing those two things is an incredible challenge. So I don't want to make it seem like it's a sort of you wish it and suddenly you're doing it, right? So it's an everyday challenge. And I think for me, to answer your question about what is my personal experience like, it's a ton of fun because I'm learning, right? And I love that aspect of my work.
And when you look back at these things, right? I mean, when you look back at what you're doing with Monzo and let's say a traditional, consumer bank that's putting an app in front of a legacy analog model. I guess one of the things that I'm doing is, what is it that holds back? We talked about the fact that technology and legacy platforms is one thing. The people obviously are different, right? I mean, you're getting people without necessarily a whole bunch of legacy mindsets and thinking, and that's probably a second one. And third is we're talking about the data and the technology. So, I mean, clearly the data and the technology is available. So it's really about the first two. So between the legacy technology and the legacy mindset, which do you think is possibly the thing that, I mean, let's say, I'm not suggesting you will, if you went back to a traditional bank, what would you think, what would be the first thing that you'd go and tell the people there to think differently about?
Gosh, where do I start? It's all of those things, Suresh, right? I wouldn't sequence it. Legacy tech is not trivial, because to change that, right, to operate in a completely microservice architecture environment, you have to start and build that afresh, right? To be able to configure product and build product at pace and do all of the stuff that is possible today, right? So you have to build that at pace. So if you were anchored on legacy tech, incredibly hard. The legacy mindset piece is an interesting one, because most people don't come in thinking they have a legacy mindset.
Interesting.
Right? We're all inhabiting a digital world, and for each one of us, the belief is, of course I'm progressive, of course I'm at the cutting edge of data. Look at all the things I do with my life, in my personal life, that are entirely digital and data driven. So and yet all of us have blind spots, right? I'm certain I have a long laundry list of blind spots as well. So I think legacy mindset as an institution is the harder thing than at an individual level. right? How do you institutionally create the right amount of challenge in it? How do you institutionally think about, making sure that you're challenging beliefs and coming up with the best possible answers each time, right? How do you institutionally be truth seeking? Those are harder than at an individual level, because, if I guarantee you, you parade 10 people of any profile and ask them to grade themselves, other than my mom, who was by her own admission, doesn't like this whole technology thing so much. There's a few exceptions like that, but almost everybody else will believe that they're at the bleeding edge.
True. And I guess, do you think that given this, and again, I like the distinction you made between that individuals like to think of ourselves as being progressive, and we probably are, and the environment sometimes is the part that's got the legacy. The institutions have the legacy rather than the individuals. Now, given this thing, and I'm just going to assume that the legacy process and technology, it is hard, and the legacy of the institution and the way they think is hard to kind of get over. Do you think a traditional bank, or I'm even moving away from banking, a traditional airline, do you think an airline or a hotel, when travel comes back, can compete against the Expedias and the Googles of the world and travel? Do you think a traditional bank will eventually be able to compete against the Monzos and the Revoluts of the world? Or do you think that this is like it's happened in the world of consumer technology? Do you think that the gap is only going to widen?
Yeah, so there's 2-3 different things in what you said, right? In the Expedia example that you gave, right? So if I look at that, the theme in that question is the people that are intermediating choice, right, or the distributors of services and products. I think that game will go, in my view, to the digital first players, right? Because they just have so much more data to firstly even present you a set of choices, right? And then to help customize it for individuals and do it at scale. So I think that game will go there. I think the question is, what are they selling? And so to your point about hotels and airlines and so on, that's the eventual product being sold or the service that is being sold. And in those particular examples, that's a very analog experience, right? As it should be, right? When you're that moment that takes your breath away when you're in a beautiful hotel with an amazing view and you're having a great experience, that is inherently analog. And we as a sort of species will continue to crave the authenticity and sort of subliminal aspect of those experiences. So the question is, what informs the creation of that experience, and in what ways do you understand data to help build stuff that people value and like? And I think that the jury is out, right? There's lots of people who will do it instinctively. There are lots of people that will mine large amounts of data. And there'll be lots of people that just, shape the future because they make a leap that's not based on saying customers are ready for a smartphone that's essentially a computer in your hand, right? There'll just be a leap that someone incredibly smart and visionary is able to make.
I think one of the things that we're seeing, TS, is this whole, how does the value chain economically go? And if you take the hotel industry, for example, I book a hotel room through an aggregator like Expedia. I might pay $200. Expedia will probably make $30 because they'll make a 15% commission. The hotel will be lucky after investing all the capital to make $5 or $10 on that room. You see it in airlines and the same thing, right? I mean, the airline's got to buy the asset, invest in the plane, do all of that stuff, and yet the aggregator who's just sitting in between and saying, I'm going to just bring the consumer to the intermediary, is making a lot of the money in that. And what you're pointing out is something quite fascinating, which is that one game you're saying is going to go away towards that intermediary because they will have the benefit of scale. But the other game of differentiation and how you actually differentiate in the physical world is still something that you have to play with. If I bring that to banking, how do you see that playing out? What does that physical bank today have to do as opposed to, let's say, a digital bank? I mean, how does that analogy play out in the world of financial services?
I think at its core, the basic insight still remains, which is, what is the customer experiencing and what tools of products or services are you making available to them to help them get about their life happily, right? Money is such a source of anxiety for people, and it's such a source of obsession. And yet right? Most people, the vast majority of this planet doesn't have the tools to manage it effectively. So if you start there and say, look, what does it need to be, right? What do you need to make customers' lives easier? Then the answers about what's physical, what's digital start to sort of thin out very quickly, right? And that's almost not even the question. It's going to be how is that? What's the tool that you need to make available? And then the answer that, look, that tool is best made available in an intuitive digital way becomes clear, right? And so you go down that path that suggests that, look, therefore digital bank that is really building with that in mind is advantaged relative to a high street bank, which is expecting a customer to make the time during business hours to walk to a branch and get either transact some simple things that they want to do or seek advice, etc., etc. And then after all of that, they're hostage to the knowledge and the filters of the particular person they're engaging with, right? So you compare all of those challenges versus what you think really needs to be made available to the customer, and it will tell you why digital models are advantaged, right? And this is entirely separate from the obvious cost advantages, et cetera, et cetera. So just that alone is a big deal. It's interesting. I think we're living at such a time of change, which is my whole sort of learner's point, right? That there will be segments which will get attracted to the idea of high touch, relationship oriented stuff. Like I said, at the end of it all, as a species, we are going to crave, that authentic analog experience as the sort of end product of whatever path we're going down. So there will be segments that will have access to that, right? But the vast majority of the planet won't. So it's hard to say, it's hard to say any particular thing, any particular sector won't succeed. It's a question of how they succeed in this particular segment or niche that they're going after.
It's kind of interesting that you're saying that, because we're on the verge this week of the biggest IPO the world has ever seen. And you've lived in Asia long enough to know the impact of Ant Financial on just the world of financial services, right?
Yeah.
And it's also interesting because your own bank, Monzo, has now actually become a fully regulated bank. And I'll just give you a third thing. I mean, I remember Piyush Gupta of DBS saying that if it walks like a bank and talks like a bank, it must be a bank, so regulated like a bank. So what's the thing that I think one of the big advantages that the digital players, the Ant Financials and the Monzos have had is that when they started off is that beyond tech and mindset, I think it was this whole thing of the ability to go out and do something in a very nimble way. And how's that going to change? I mean, how is regulation? And regulation is coming not just to this industry. You always worked in a regulated industry, but it's also coming, like if you take the US, it's going to come to big tech as well. So where do you think regulation is going to step in to stop this, perhaps take away this competitive advantage that data and tech is giving companies today?
So look, let me answer the Monzo thing and then get to the broader part of your question. So as it relates to Monzo, we chose to be a regulated bank, and we got, we went through a licensing process early on, and we've operated as a fully regulated bank. And the hypothesis was that, you're trying to be the repository of customers' money and the trust that comes with being a bank versus playing on the fringes of the sector, right? We chose to be a bank and be inside the sector, reinvent the industry from within as a regulated entity. So, and what that does mean for us is that we have really high standards to meet, right? Regulatory standards of controls and risk management, et cetera, et cetera. The payoff of all of that is that therefore we earn the customer's trust that, look, that's who we are. And, of course, examples abound around the world of people that chose to not be a regulated entity to begin with, right? In whatever sector they were playing in, right? I'm not saying just in the world of banking and financial services, but eventually, as you're saying, regulations caught up. I think, around the world, that thing that the regulators are paying more attention to it, learning what business models are being crafted on the back of digital and data, right? So that trend is going to keep increasing. And, without sort of moving even past banking, just the world of technology in general is going to attract regulatory attention, because regulators, as representative of elected governments and so on are going to try to answer the question of, is this good for society? Right? What's the unintended consequence that's being created? How do we mitigate against that? And that will happen along, the obvious axes which get a lot of attention, like competition and use of data and so on. Obviously, there's a ton of regulation already in that space, but it will probably go beyond, because if you read the kinds of questions regulators are asking and what they're hoping to learn about businesses and business models, there's a long list of things out there that I hope result in sensible regulation, because then that enables good innovation as well.
Absolutely. So TS, if you go back, and I'm sure we could keep talking for a few more hours on this topic. I'm going to I picked up a few things. I'm also going to tell people there's no false binary between my interest in consumer behavior and tech. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about is your fears. You're seeing technology. You're sitting in a place where the use of technology and data is exploding. What are the fears that you have about how far this would go? We've had these complaints about fair lending and how algos tend to be biased, etc. But even beyond that, what are the algos that you fear today? What are the things that trends that you worry about?
So look, I'll tell you the conditions of fear for me on this stuff, right? One is reinforcement of biases, especially reinforcement of biases that are less visible. I'll give you a simple example of that, right? Which is something I was reading the other day. So in clinical trials for new medicines and so on in the US, for new drug trials in the US, there's been a really interesting history of regulation around clinical trials and the samples and people that are allowed to be a part of a clinical trial. There was actually regulation in the 70s which prohibited women of certain age groups in their best interests from being in clinical trials, right? Which at the time was I think architected and intended to be to protect women of childbearing age, or whatever the definition of it was. But the result of that, think about the longer term consequences of drugs that were rolled out and approved by drug regulators that had not actually been tested on a massive part of the population. And what does that suggest about the efficacy of that and how those drugs work? So that stuff has gotten unwound over the decades, but it was a thing. And that's an unintended consequence of a decision that was explicitly made about a sample, but it obviously would have reinforced biases. Now you extend that, and that's one sort of specific example. But the whole idea of reinforcement of biases, which to your point about fair lending, which clearly does seeks to address that. But the reinforcement of biases in a political context, in a social context, is something we're witnessing all around us, right? The polarization that comes with people being in their respective echo chambers is scary. So that's a big condition of fear for me. The second is scale, because when stuff happens at scale, it also becomes much harder to contain, and it creates sort of a diaspora of consequences that you can't put that back in the bottle later. So that worries me as well. And then the third sort of aspect of this condition of fear, to answer to the question, is if it's across touch points in a way that there is nothing which questions those biases in a way that you figure out, right? So being in an echo chamber where you don't ever speak to someone that's outside of that, right? Because every touch point of your physical and digital life just reinforces those biases. That stuff is very scary to me.
I can completely understand. And this whole idea of explainable AI is something that's coming about, right? Which is that, you understand the algo is doing its work, but you have to be able to explain it either to the regulator or to the consumer and say how you arrived at it. In fact, one of the things that we basically are thinking about in our own company is that this is going to become a thing, that it's not about the fact that an AI took the decision, but what actually lies behind that.
Yeah.
And it is a scary thing. But I do want to. I mean, it's not all about fear alone, right? I mean, the fact is that data and AI has enabled a whole bunch of things to be done that wasn't possible a few years ago. So, what excites you about this field? Over the next 2-3 years, what are the big changes that you see that things that are going to happen that wasn't possible 2-3 years ago?
I mean, so the biggest thing that excites me is also something that gives me a little bit of pause and concern, right? Which is, as I was saying, right, and we were talking about this behavioral scientists thing a little while ago, right? That it's possible to nudge people towards choices that could benefit them, right? The problem is who decides, right? And the problem is what happens when that tool is in the hands of a bad actor of any sort, right? A bad actor could also, and doesn't even have to be a bad actor by design, by intent. It could be just a bad actor in terms of how it's managed. And so that stuff starts to get worrisome as well. But at the core of it, the idea that with this combination of crazy amounts of instant digital distribution and intelligence to power the messages that you put out there, right? You could just as easily create a planet of amazing consequences, right? Because you've reinforced messages that are good for humanity, right? But just as easily, right, you're on the knife edge of that getting misused as well. But the power of it being used well excites me.
That is such a wonderful thought. In fact, I've always been wondering, right? I mean, we always talk about the consequences, for example, of using plastic bags, but if I never get a positive nudge for actually using my cloth bag.
There you go.
And
right.
it's the same thing really, but no one ever is telling us, hey, if you did this thing, you would actually benefit the world. And we're always hearing about the negative thing. TS, any closing thoughts as you're going into this? I mean, like I said, you've seen a variety of change over data and AI. Any single closing thought about how you think maybe the next generation is going to be looking at this whole stuff? I mean, we look at it, wow, but is it going to become such a part of everybody's life? Any closing thoughts at all on what you see a world out of this?
Yeah, it is here to stay. And I think my hope is that we have the right amount of sort of enlightened conversations about where it's going. How do you correct biases? How do you deal with, who gets to make choices? How do you create sensible regulation around the space? And so my hope is that those dialogues happen and those dialogues are amplified so consumers understand where things are going and are able to shape the macro choices, right? I love the what you've talked about explainable AI. So I love trends like that because it's back to saying, look, it's not just providing the illusion of choice, but explanation for what sits behind it, and customers get to choose. I would love things like, back to my music selection thing. If I said, look, in my recommendations, I want 30% of stuff to be randomized just because I want to be exposed to something different than what you think my pigeonhole is. I'd love that to be parameterized in ways that expose me to stuff. Political views, right? I love that I have a diverse set of friends, so I hear different views, but maybe I don't. That maybe I need to hear other views as well. So if we are able to provide tools that give people the ability to see beyond what the AI bot's recommendation is to them, and make it explainable, make it more enlightened, I think this could be amazing.
It's so funny you mentioned the thing about parameterizing, because one of the things we try and do in our thing is that we say we want to set this to be at least 60% discovery versus 40% repeat, right? And it is parameterizable in some ways, and that's such a lovely thought to end on. But I have a question, which is going back to the title of what I call this. I deliberately chose to call this series Slaves to the Algo, because I said, algos are taking over our lives and we don't even know it. Do you foresee a future in 5 years or 10 years time, if you had to fast forward and have this conversation, do you foresee that we will be slaves to the algo, or do you think we'll be masters of the algo?
I think the question for me is will we even know which we are? Right. So it's easy for all of us. That's why I was saying it's easy for all of us to believe we're not slaves in our personal lives and so on. But who knows? How do you tell? So there's enough fun dystopian fiction and TV around, what possibilities exist. I think they're all in the realm of the possible, Suresh. I think none of those scenarios are, you can look at it and say, this is never going to happen. This could never happen. I think we're living at a time when, if you look out, maybe 5-10 years is maybe a little too short for it. But if you put a 20-year axis on this, it's easy to see how there could be like significant discontinuities, over that period. So I only hope we know what's happening.
I love that thought. Who knows? And I hope we know. Thank you very much, TS, for spending time on this show. To our listeners and viewers, that was TS Anil, Group CEO of Monzo, talking to us about how he's seen the world of data and algorithms change over his career and what he sees for the future. Once again, thank you for being on the show, TS.
Always fun chatting with you, Suresh. Take care.
We have new episodes coming out every week, sometimes twice a week. Each will seek to bring a different and fresh perspective to the topic. Please subscribe to the podcast channel and share it widely in your network. I look forward to speaking to you in the next episode. Meanwhile, stay safe personally in the age of COVID and stay relevant professionally in the age of AI.